Welcome back, everybody. We are continuing with our third presentation of the first day of the European MMT conference. And we're here with Professor of Economics Zdravka Todorova from Wright State University in the US. She will be presenting a lecture on MMT, Veblen'S theory, and feminist institutional economics. As always, we will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. And if you are watching us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, you can post your questions on the comments under the live stream. I will do my best to include as many questions as possible, but if your questions are brief, they will have more of a chance to be included. So do as best you can to keep them brief. So without further ado, Professor Todorova, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Dirk and Michael, and to all organizers of the conference for allowing me the chance to tell you about my framework and how I look at money and the economy. So, as you see, I'm talking about the work of Thorstein Veblen in connection to feminist economics, as well as to some points of modern money theory. So that you understand where I'm coming from, I just want very briefly about my academic work and why I'm coming up with this topic today. And so if we look at the very bottom, around 2005, I started inquiring into this false separation between so-called financial and political economy issues. And so I questioned this duality between the financial and the so real economy. And then I discussed those in the context of understanding deficits and households and the false analogy between household budgets and government or state federal budgets, arguing that basically this disembodies or treats economic agents as if without bodies, but at the same time attributes some sort of a lifespan to governments, ignoring the nature of money. And this was related to the book that I wrote about money and households, and I spent some time discussing the role of the unpaid work within households, linking to heterodox microeconomics questions about money and effective demand and government policy, specifically of employer of last resort, is what I ended up the work with. And then I eventually started connecting this to a broader notion of Keynes' socialization of investment and to the concept of social provisioning that comes out of institutional, feminist, and social economics. In all of this, I discussed the tension between the focus on financial sectors and getting the economy back to work through stimulating the financial sector while ignoring the needs of households. And also, after that, I spent time developing the concept of social provisioning and specifically the economy as a social provisioning, and also spent quite a lot of time discussing this notion of social processes. In all of these, the work of Thorstein Veblen has been very important, as well as the work from feminist economics. And so, for this reason, I want to spend today some time talking about Thorstein Veblen's work. And he has quite a lot of publications, but one way that I want to introduce you to all of those is to just pinpoint some guiding posts in terms of his publications and to relate them to points and concepts that are relevant both to modern money or understanding money, as well as feminist economics. First, I consider Thorstein Veblen as a feminist economist himself, which is not very well recognized, but nonetheless it's a position that has been taken before. So for me, in my work, those issues of understanding money, also the points that Veblen made, as well as feminist economics concern, always have been going together. Initially, I took a post-Keynesian approach, but I want to remind you that both post-Keynesianism as well as Veblen are coming out of political economy, and that political economy was narrow to what today we know as mainstream economics in its varieties, but nonetheless narrowed. And so contemporary heterodox economic theory is the way to continue, of course, a contemporary political economy. And I argue that Veblen is a major figure in that. So some of the first of all, those guiding posts of some of Veblen's publications, of course, are just symbols. There are quite a lot of other writings. And of course, the most famous writing of Veblen is the theory of the leisure class. And what people usually do is they look at the theory of the leisure class, and often in a very narrow way, just talking about, for example, conspicuous consumption, in separation from his overall theory. I look at all of his writings in their interconnection. And what often happens in the literature is people just grab words and separate those from the overall concepts and theories of production, distribution, consumption that Veblen had. So what my attempt here is to draw some of those connections. And a good starting point is Veblen's famous article, Why is Economics Not an Evolutionary Science? But that is related to quite a lot of his writings on economic theory and critique of, at his time, the emergence of neoclassical economics. And one of the major critique is that the neoclassical economics basically of his time disembodied the agent or the economic individual. And that meant that it considers the economic agent outside of nature and outside of history. And the utility theory of that time had to do a lot of that. But of course, this is directly related to the conception of money as a kind of only medium of exchange, I argue. And so basically, once we consider a different theory of money as a relational institution rather than a thing or a commodity, we also consider simultaneously with that, reconsider living agents as based in biology, history, and culture. This, of course, involves a non-dualistic conceptions of the economy, and that has been also quite a lot of the focus of feminist economics as well as institutional economics. And my attempt has been to use Veblen's work to move beyond these kind of immutable categories and to develop further the notion of process. And this involves also the notion of money as a debt credit process. So Veblen himself spent time talking about the importance of refocusing economics as an evolutionary science, which meant the development of process and considering the economy as part of the life process itself. Now, this, of course, involves, and he discussed that, the notion of cumulative causation, which basically he opposed to this predominant ideas of natural concepts, natural laws, or principles that are static and given, predetermined, and instead he discussed the importance of cumulative causation and cumulative processes, which are important for understanding any crisis or any inequities, for example, as well as the development of resources. The connection to understanding money is about basically resource creation and the importance of MMT, as well as institutional economics and post-Keynesian economics specifically, is a reversing of the causation of saving and investment, where saving is a residual, but also thinking about deficits or government deficits as a residual of economic activities, or driven also by different commitments to economic activities. Also, reversal of the causation between spending and taxes, and the idea that spending comes first and taxes follow. But one thing I want to point out in this first life process concept as a central organizing concept in economics is that, in fact, and Veblen made this point, there is no dualistic distinction between normative and prescriptive. And even though in the context of modern money, we know that we're describing the actual monetary system as we understand the reality of that monetary system and the nature or character of money, we also necessarily are making kind of a prescriptive, there are prescriptive consequences in terms of unveiling the myth of money. So next point that comes out of Veblen's writing is that surplus, the generation of surplus in the economy is the main organizing concept that is directly related to hierarchies, which include classes, economic classes, social classes, but also Veblen spends quite a lot of time on gender relation, and this is discussed in the theory of the leisure class, but also in other writings, such as an essay called The Barbarian Status of Women, which he directly relates to his writings on the origins of ownership. And in this discussion, he has predation as not as an individual only act, but as a kind of a socially organizing process within the economy, where in fact an economy could be organized on a kind of predatory activities that are further separated from the ability of the economy to generate livelihood. And in this discussion, gender relations central in the maintenance of a kind of hierarchical structure. And this is discussed, this is the subject of the theory of the leisure class. Of course, most of the time people talk only about conspicuous consumption, but conspicuous consumption is part of this predatory process in terms of exhibiting the ability to have leisure without work, but that is predicated on a class, the existence of a class structure. Towards the end of the book, interestingly, Veblen spends quite a lot of time talking about what he calls a non-invidious institutions and the emergence of his time of the so-called non-invidious changes of arranging institutions around greater rights for women in terms of, for example, their education, voting, and so forth, and exiting this kind of so-called private sphere. In fact, he directly relates the changes in his time to a change of a habit of thought, of thinking of separate spheres of the household, where women, especially of the leisure class, were kind of having a decorative function. But of course, the economy in itself is supported by women working from other classes. But nonetheless, there is a kind of a process of emulation of these so-called separate spheres. And he discussed directly that the way we think about households and the markets as the kind of separate spheres has directly to do with how we think about gender relations, and of course also how we are open to institutional change. So for this reason, I said that Veblen has a kind of feminist writing too. and that is embedded and central, I think, for his overall theory. The next, to use another writing, this is already gone 1914, The Instinct of Workmanship and the State of Industrial Arts. This is a book, but there are quite a lot of other essays. For example, one is the essay called On the Instinct of Workmanship and the Irksomeness of Labor, where he discusses how, of course, we have to make distinction between labor as a kind of a fictitious commodity, and to make distinction between work as something that actually people want to engage and do, because people are kind of multidimensional individuals. They want to create, they want to contribute and to be satisfied with what they contribute. And so he makes this distinction, and he says, unfortunately, because labor is a commodity and because of the structural organization of labor, it is kind of undesirable, but labor is the center of production of livelihood in the economy. And when he talks about labor, he doesn't talk in a dualistic way. He doesn't make this distinction between material and immaterial. And that kind of book also makes this point from the point of view of our understanding of technology, our understanding of capital, and the place of curiosity and work and innovation, invention in all that. And of course, when Veblen discusses work, he talks about workmanship, but also he talks about the structure, the hierarchy of work, and that some work is unfortunately within the hierarchy kind of in the form of drudgery. It's the least valued and undesirable work with the least status, but at the same time necessary, most important for the maintenance of the economy, and even though it is a drudgery and without status, that often has to do with the care that, as I said before, under the life process, is central to the economy. And so in Veblen and in my work, this notion between productive and reproductive in a way doesn't exist as a kind of a dualistic formulation. So I mentioned a number of times this departure away from dualistic conceptions, but one central understanding in Veblen is about dichotomy of valuation, and dichotomy is different from dualism. I will stress later again. This is the ability to understand the different aspects of a process or a different aspects of a phenomena. And so with regards to work, for example, Veblen discussed the so-called pecuniary and industrial employment, or in the context of production, this will be kind of the business concern versus the industrial concern. Of course, when we talk about industrial, and if we consider the life process, care and addressing human vulnerabilities, a part of this notion of industrial. What industrial in Veblen's context means is activity supporting livelihood. When he uses the word immaterial, he means immaterial for sustaining life, right? It's not the usual material as a kind of material resources and machines, and immaterial as some sort of services and so on. That does not exist in Veblen. And so while workmanship is central in Veblen for the development of resources, he also directly discusses together with coercion. So workers are subject to kind of a coercive process, but it doesn't mean that a kind of he is an anti-work type, presents an anti-work type of discussion. And so this for MMT is relevant when we discuss the design of job guarantee and the importance also of providing a job guarantee. Once we consider the multidimensional kind of individual, once we exit this material and material type of dualisms, we can talk about the importance of work outside of necessary commodification or wage relations subject to market valuation. Next type of writings that Veblen had, and again, they are very much connected to the previous ones, is his theory of the business enterprise, which eventually he developed further into his last book, about absentee ownership. And in between, I want to mention also his work on higher learning, which is basically discussion of the universities from the prism of a business enterprise. So in his theory of the business enterprise, he discusses the role of credit and the expansion of credit, which is important for us in terms of understanding, first of all, that money is a real phenomenon in terms of determining or participating in the direction of output in the economy and employment. But also he discusses that in the production economy, obviously there's a distinction between business concern and industrial concern. And that, in fact, the economy can produce, of course, more than what it's producing. And he has this famous concept of the sabotage of production, which is basically driven by the business or financial concern. We can think also of this at the more at the government even level, when we talk about sabotage of meeting needs, for example, and voluntarily engaging in a kind of scarcity. When we talk about running out of money, paying for, and so forth. But the development of Veblen's work from the theory of the business enterprise from 1904 to 1923 into absentee ownership is important. In the absentee ownership, he basically discusses how production by markets has departed even further from needs and livelihood, and the role of finance into that. And basically, he discussed this in terms of financial capitalism, to use also Minsky's term, or Minsky at that time talked. This stage of Minsky is the banker's capitalism. In that process, Veblen described extractionism and the encroachment on nature, and for the purpose of creating intangible assets, and also described in all of his work the presence of what he nicely called vendible imponderables as the kind of the focus of production. And of course, we can relate this to all sorts of social costs and to contemporary kind of waste that are embedded in the market economy. This is to point out that the market economy is centered often on producing waste rather than on producing needs or producing resources for needs. And of course, that is to be contrasted often to the assumption that in fact the government is producing waste. Of course, government support and produce waste, but this kind of duality between market versus government is also a false duality. At the same time, understanding that the distinction between resource creation and monetary scarcity or monetary or money is, of course, as you know, the central for modern money theory, and that is why I think there is a direct link in terms of Veblen's theory. Finally, within all this, the notion of invidious distinction, these are Veblen's terms, invidious distinction is central, meaning that our economy is not just about producing resources, but this production of resources is based, in fact, on hierarchies that are not just hierarchies, but they're invidious in terms of basically they're hateful. And so this, of course, has to do with distribution and in terms of our decisions to direct resources. This has to do with basically using money either to restrict resources or to permit resources. And this is basically in the context of life process. This means that we are restricting or permitting lives. In all that, Veblen discussed the specifically in his 1919 book, Vested Interest and the Common Man. He discussed not only the class structure, but also other types of invidious distinction, including around the state and nationalism, the role of media propaganda, and expert discourses, such as, for example, understanding the economy. And understanding the economy as a kind of natural, based as if on natural rights, and specifically applying this to property, is the kind of thing that goes over Veblen's work. But in relation to modern money and to functional finance, an important link to be made here is that once we talk about scarcity of money and we cannot afford this and that, we have to think about that we are basically discussing the limitations of people's lives and the preservation of specific vested interests. Veblen directly linked vested interest to what he called free income, and free income is generated always on the production or productive capacity resources of the economy, but has to do with claiming income or rent, to put it in the context of political economy, which he basically builds on. And the scarcity at the macro level in terms of government expenditure and debates as we are having today, it's about preserving the free income or rents, and it's about preserving vested interest, and also it's about preserving power relation and status quo. As today we have kind of negotiations of what is to go in terms of social infrastructure and so forth. These negotiations really about not permitting lives for people. So as you have heard, I have made distinctions between the concept of dualism and dichotomy. There are many false dualisms that have been discussed a lot in feminist economics, as well as in institutional economics. That is why I'm talking about feminist institutional economics. But one thing that often is not understood is that it's useful to make a distinction between challenging dualism, but also it's useful to apply the so-called Veblenian dichotomy. And dichotomy has to do with looking at kind of aspects of something that is connected, while dualism is about separate and often and always opposed, but also hierarchical things that are falsely opposed. So, for example, in the context of money, we challenge the dualism of money versus real activities if they're two separate sectors, or money being a veil. This has to do directly with the commodity theory of money. Another dualism, of course, is care versus markets, where in fact the markets are based on and cannot be conceived outside of care, and there are many others to be discussed. But to discuss those dualisms, in fact, it's helpful to rely on the dichotomy between, for example, what is serviceable for an economy and what is based on financial motivation, or what is accumulation in terms of resources versus accumulation in terms of individual wealth. When Veblen discussed, for example, immaterial, he says that free income or rent is immaterial for the overall economy, but it's very material for the individuals who receive the free income, right? So these are the type of kind of dichotomies. That's not dualism. creating and mobilizing resources versus focusing on government debt and deficits as a criteria is another way to understand this dichotomy, which is part of modern money. And so this understanding of dichotomies help us to uncover needs and oppressions, and therefore are essential for re-envisioning the economy when we want to depart from these false and oppressive dualisms. So I have written, basically all my writings have this, but in two of them I spent some time actually talking about the importance of distinguishing dualism and dichotomy. One other often term, binary, should not be also conflated with those, although it's more akin to dualism. A binary has to do with either or. So basically you cannot conceive of you conceive only of one thing, or you again make a false simplistic separation, like I said, more akin to dualism. So towards kind of want to articulate a little bit more on connecting those things directly to some elements of modern money. And I have rewritten these elements for my own purposes here. But one thing I want to stress often, and there have been claims that the origins of money and the nature, and when I say nature, I mean, you know, the meaning, substance of what money is, are not important. I think it's extremely important to challenge the story of barter and so forth, because that story is used to say all the others arguments and stories that serve as a myth in our monetary economy. So when we have origins of money as an element of modern money, if we try to connect to feminist institutional insights, this is directly connected to what in fact are markets. The markets are socially organized, and the role of power as well as authority created, because are created of the economy, as if the state is interfering into some sort of natural markets, right? To exit this, we need to understand money, and we need to understand also that there are a multitude of relations within the, this is also important from a feminist point of view, because we need to understand a multitude of agencies and oppressions, and as well as possibilities. Another important part related to origins of money is we begin to question this as if fixed natural categories of taxpayer or even consumer. I have part, those are political categories that narrow the roles of individuals in the economy, and this is not non-incidental for distributions and arguments of consumer sovereignty or pay for, we ran out of money and so forth, markets can do all. The second element I have combined quite a lot, basically that I made for a little bit more talking about micro. But the second element, and I really don't see too much difference between those arguments about money is endogenous, state money, they go together. In terms of arguments, I mean, those are directly related to how the payment system is organized, how money is created. It's not dropped with helicopters, it's not exogenous and so forth, and also directly related to our understanding of the accounting. But of course, and going back here a little to post-Keynesian thought, this is directly related to understanding the role of saving as a residual, but also understanding the role of deficit as a kind of outcomes rather than a starting point of policy analysis. To connect this to feminist and institutional thought, what is relevant in terms of connection is this, when we talk about endogenous money, really we're talking about the persistence of instabilities and fragilities and inequities in the economy, and directly linking to the Veblen'S dichotomy of pecuniary versus industrial valuation. In terms of needs, cannot be addressed by markets, as well as particularly markets that create fragility and instability. So then I already spoke of the paucity of markets are not separate from some sort of non-market activity, and care is central, and markets and the markets and the creation of money cannot be seen outside of care. But at the same time, we don't want to talk or oppose the so-called care economy to the rest of the market economy, which is a false opposition. And then another point, when we talk about the sectoral accounting and savings and deficits, household government analogy in terms of the budget, then a kind of a conflation between households and states. And in my book, spent time discussing how households are unique institutions. Of course, this is should be straightforward, but when we think about the household budget, state budget analogy, in fact, we're conflating those. Then I want to spend a little bit more time on area needs more development, modern money theory, and my work initially started as a kind of bridging micro and macro orthodox theory, as well as making link between post-Keynes and institutional feminist economics, and then moved on to building kind of heterodox economic theory and looking at social provisioning as organizing concept, and the economy is social provisioning. Within this, it's very important to have a developed heterodox micro, and we have, and that is important to be incorporated and already has been to some extent theory. Even though modern money theory is a description of how money works and how our financial system is, like I said, we cannot kind of make a clear-cut separation between description of reality and prescription of what is, and some of the biggest prescriptive concepts within mainstream economics are at the level of micro. So, for example, the price theory. Well, in heterodox economics, we have the administered prices as an alternative, but this includes also wage setting, the price of labor. And so if we think about modern money, when we talk about job guarantee, obviously in this scheme, the setting of the price of labor is central. And this includes also recognizing that labor needs maintenance, reproduction, as well as that labor basically is about people that have generally multidimensional needs that are in fact part of the economy. It's not about individual choice only between work and leisure and so forth. So administered prices is one area. The mere understanding of markets as socially organized and also as a kind of market, as a planning. We usually think about central planning as some sort of government thing, but look, this is an argument made quite a lot in institutional economics. Look at markets, they're the ones in the business enterprises and vested interests are the ones that are doing central planning. And this maintains hierarchies. And so within all this, there are inequities, and the notion of consumer sovereignty is a myth. And so when we ground all of these into kind of living people as a kind of the economic agents, we're seeing that the heterodox concepts developed in the micro theory also part of the overall story of money, scarcity, and lives. Finally, I will conclude saying that, of course, kind of an updated view of functional finance is another element of MMT that goes together with recognizing that there could be different public purposes and that we want a public purpose centered on people and challenging oppressions. And job guarantee is one part of it. I think job guarantee is as important for MMT as is the origins of money. I think that job guarantee and MMT go together. I mean, this doesn't mean that obviously we prefer to have any sort of employment programs that lead to kind of addressing people's needs and more progressive change. But I think the full-fledged job guarantee requires understanding and challenge money and challenging also the limitations, unnecessary limitations of policy space, as well as challenging power relations that allow those limitations to move. So then when we talk about job guarantee, obviously the economy being larger than markets, I think it's central, and this is directly related to points made in feminist economics, but basically in terms of operationally how this enters the design of job guarantee is obviously to create jobs that are identifying needs, identify activities that are already taking place, but they are not paid, they are contributing, they are constituting economy, and to support life-sustaining community. Contributing to invidious distinctions. But so we don't want to idealize communities, but to look at just generally in communities is obviously discussed in the job guarantee, refocus a public purpose. I believe probably I'm almost out of time. I just want to briefly end up with my efforts of how I have kind of tried to envision the economy as a social provisioning, combining culture and nature, and where we want to move away from these separate spheres of the environment, the economy, and the social. And so I have developed kind of this discussion of processes that is based on kind of both theory as well as what I understand in terms of empirical findings. But those processes, again, the emphasis is they're not predetermined, they're not set in stone. They are subject to change depending on whatever the context of the research is. They are just to help the initial formulation and thinking about a problem depending on whatever context. The central part here, the so-called economic, I call them so-called because I don't see personally anymore the difference between economic and social and natural. And so the so-called economic, I have used quite a lot of Veblen'S theory to kind of rethink those economic processes. Of course, care is fundamental, but we can think about articulating beyond just kind of workers involved in labor process, but there is a recreation process. I have written on consumption as a process. They're all interrelated, but the interlinks will be driven by the question is. So there is no kind of a theoretical causations here. But with respect to, well, all of them, all of it obviously is related. All of it is related to accumulation. But in terms of thinking of money, often we think of, we want to exit, obviously, the view of money, but that has to do with different relations. So I have kind of a different work on that, but also it involves other kind of relations where money is not precluded, that non-monetary obligations, the reciprocity, and so on, so forth, moving out of just exchange, and furthermore simplified a notion of exchange. So think about money. It gives opportunity, obviously, for mobility. So when I say mobility residence, this is a process also of liquidity. When about communication, expression and persuasion processes, creation, institutional economics in Veblen, the emphasis on the creation of resources that is limited to our knowledge and how we develop knowledge, but that depends a lot in the capitalist economy, investment driven by monetary motive. But the notion of investment is, I use the term undertaking. And so when we talk of socialization of investment and so forth, really when we broaden this notion, we're talking about undertaking, which also takes the non-oriented part of undertaking just for profit. Enterprise quite a lot on this notion of machine process. This is what we in the capitalist system action. Also, he just opened, and he opened the way to discuss the machine process in terms of its influence in other areas of life, in the work life, and this is the theme going through from Adam Smith, for example, but also in our everyday life. There is quite a lot that we can talk about machine process, how standardization, human action takes place. And this also ways to connect to many other social theories. Supervision and surveillance is a central process that often we focus on discussing production, consumption, distribution, but I mean, a central, what I try to do here is to break down the economy in different terms. And supervision and surveillance, I do not need to discuss much in our context, but is central for and can be related to all of those, obviously. But I want to emphasize that threat and punishment should be seen as a kind of percent or central processes also in our economy. When we think especially about unemployment, the threat of losing your healthcare and all of those things, how it is embedded within our economy. Again, all of those will take different form. The circumstances will be different in different contexts. And when we talk about the various deprivations, waste being a central part of the economy, and all of those also being based on violence and so forth. This has been kind of the purpose to use this terminology. Like I said, a lot of it inspired by Veblen and my thinking also in relation to political economy, in relation to feminist economics. And all of those, again, the whole point is to embody an economic analysis, meaning to consider the biospheric processes, the bodies and the physical spaces that, of course, are never only physical, they are related to our social and economic organizations. In terms of the social, my purpose has been to move away from kind of fixed categories analysis and to consider, for example, gender as a process. I believe that Veblen basically was talking about that in the theory of the leisure class. And that's what I took also in my Money Household book, but needs further development. And this has been kind of where I'm coming from in terms of articulating kind of these so-called social, where I make distinction between economic class, for example, and social class. And again, this is a living thing that can be, these categories are not set, but are meant to engage in what I can call evolutionary intersectional analysis. Once again, when we talk about money, money being not a commodity, but a relation, it's not only about money facilitating this, and money creating or being part of those processes directly. So I'm not sure how much I still have further, but I think I'll just end up here. I mean, we can talk quite a lot. I want just to conclude that when we talk about money, at the same time, when we try to understand money, is to understand the kind of the embodied agents, and to refocus on these processes that allows us understanding of cumulative causation, instead of accepting these so-called natural markets and treating government as intervention in disturbing the market, which is a kind of the new liberal view of the economy. Veblen spent quite a lot of time on discussing this made-up notion of disruption of the market. Markets obviously are created, and they are created often with kind of oppressions, as well as contributing to oppressions. And within this, the state is not a kind of a separate. Veblen quite a lot of talks about the relation between markets and states. And then this, of course, allows us to treat crisis differently, as persistent, as endemic, as well as to look at different types of crisis, to look at different types of deficits, the care deficit, which has been written quite a lot, all sorts of deficits, not just monetary deficits, and to recognize the vulnerabilities of the individuals in terms of expiring individuals, in terms of biological beings. For this reason, I think those oppressions and agencies, it's important to have this evolutionary intersectionalities beyond these fixed categories. And for that reason, we have a kind of non-dualistic view of the economy and understanding the dichotomies of evaluation, which allows us to uncover needs and oppressions and to re-envision the economy. So money and the embodied agents, understanding of those go together. I will stop here and maybe we can have questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Todorova, for the very interesting lecture. I think we now address some questions from the audience, and straight away I see a very interesting question from Daniel Haim on the topic of social provisioning and the job guarantee. So he asks, should a public job guarantee pay for care work at home? For example, in the 1970s wage for household argument, or should we socialize care work? By socializing, he means institutionalizing through communal centers for childcare or elder care, or through mobile care workers. What are your views on that?
So in 2009, ended up with this kind of discussion of socializing care work or unpaid household work, building on previous feminist political economies. And I argued, I really don't think we want to take a position necessarily, a fixed position. In the spirit of being flexible and providing workers flexibility, which is one of the points that we want to address with a job guarantee, I will say that both are not incompatible, that you can have a care work that is paid within the job guarantee in terms of provided with, or designed within the job guarantees, as well as have in-home payment. Now, I have not worked out exactly how and what, and I don't think that, generally, we can work on that. I don't want to have a rigid position on this. I think, however, that it is reasonable to argue that both could be. First of all, also, I want to say that when we talk about job guarantee, we also talk a kind of a broader package of the wage, but also we hope also for a broader change in terms of social services and programs. For example, unpaid leave or universal unpaid leave, which is currently something that more and more, of course, people recognize in the context of the United States, for example, that it's not universal, it's not available to everybody, that should be part of it. And so in this, so we want to address also some issues outside of job guarantee in terms of overall structural change and in social programs too. But I am not opposed. The socialization of housework is not only well, it has different dimensions. There is a value of people being together, and socialization of housework. There is a value of communal housework, and I don't want each individual household to work only on their own. There is a value in communal sharing. I will put it that way. But so I don't want to say as a kind of a presumption either or, both should be available. The private within the household payment builds up the flexibility of workers, the flexibility that workers and individuals have, and the communal socialization of housework has the benefit of a changing mindset of care outside of the household. Both, and I think job guarantee can support both.
Thank you for saying that, because we know that, well, at the moment, women carry the largest burden for care responsibilities in the home, and that it is often one of the main reasons that they choose to leave employment. But I like the idea that they, we shouldn't try to force women to take any particular path, economic path. That if they wish, to work, then institutional care group should be there for them as an option. But if they also wish to stay at home and continue with their care duties, it should also have that option. And in terms of furthering the options of women, what would you say institutional economics points to the kind of the biggest economic oppressions faced by women at the moment? And I guess I'm talking most specifically about the European context here.
I do not know if only institutional economics. Generally, feminist economics. The reason I want to emphasize institutional economics is I believe institutional economics should have more impact and recognition within feminist economics, but also we can just talk about generally in this context. So this question about feminist economics, obviously, the control over women's time, the flexibility, the access to security and ability to exit oppressive relations, be it at work or being in the house. I think the job guarantee for that, as we have discussed before, has place and role to play. With respect, you mentioned Europe particularly, but also everywhere. But specifically in Europe, you have migrant workers. Your economies depend on the migrant workers. Your consumers depend on the migrant workers. They are women and men. You have truck drivers, mostly men. You have care workers, mostly women from Eastern Europe, are essential to the economy. I would say that these are challenges for women in Europe. And I would like to see a job guarantee within the whole Europe that is open to all without borders, right? So can you do that? That's a challenge. Obviously, women's bodies want access to health, but also keeping encroachment on people's bodies is important for women. Anything related to exiting oppressions, not at the expense of somebody else's oppression. So if we can address care deficit by importing migrant women to take care, who is going to take care of their children? I mean, this is widely discussed issue of care chains within feminist economics, and not only feminist economics generally. This is, I think, the biggest challenge for feminists is to solve problems without exporting them to somebody else and using other people. And I think to go back to modern money, I think this refocusing, in understanding and challenging this idea that we cannot pay for things is central, especially since you mentioned European Union. It's obvious to me that that is not that could be addressed, and then within other economies that so-called less sovereign in terms of policy state, economies have rich on resources. So then it's obviously the political struggle in those economies that are not rich on resources, collaborations amongst economies. In this context, basically all the feminist concerns are really kind of also international political economy concerns.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So Rafael Barbieri Camata is asking, do you think that Veblen does a positive analysis in the theory of the leisure class? If so, do you think that this book is an exception in Veblen's usual dichotomic method?
Positive analysis. Rafael, what is this positive analysis? No, in either way, I would say that the theory of the leisure class is the foundation of all, or a good starting point for connecting all the work in Veblen. I don't see any separation between the theory of the leisure class and the other works. I mean, I think actually it's important to connect theory of business enterprise, theory of leisure class, absentee ownership to his methodological writings. I do not know what you mean positive. There is no positive versus normative. And that's one of his points. Yeah. If I have misunderstood, you can ask a follow-up question if you want. If not, just go ahead.
Well, unless he sends another comment, I guess we'll assume that we understood the question, right? So I guess the next question would be, you mentioned that there were that jobs to people and employment were important beyond the wages and income aspects of the job. What would you say are the main factors outside of wages and income that jobs that people derive from employment and jobs?
Belonging, although it's easy to slip into considering the individual only as a worker and to say that you can find belonging only through work. Everybody, especially nowadays, after this pandemic, understands even more so that work cannot be the only way of belonging. But when you don't have a work, especially within a capitalist society, you also lose social connection. Part of within a capitalist society, a significant part of belonging. Transition doesn't happen at once. And also, I want to stress that when we talk about wage work, which is a major institution in capitalism, again, it's not the same thing of talking about work generally as part of human being. going back to Veblen again, you want to create something naturally. I think people get depressed when they feel like they're not creative. And to a certain extent, many private market jobs have this creativity, right? I don't want to oppose and say that markets never make people happy, but when you don't have access to this market, you want to be having access to a job that is guaranteed. Again, I assume that the audience knows about the types of jobs that they're the living wage, that they're not with many with skills that require quite a lot of training. So that gives a psychological security in addition to avenue for belonging and not dropping out of social networks as well as a labor force. Again, I think that the types of jobs that will address generally also communal relations. So when I say belonging through work in this context is also creating and enhancing what already communities do, as long as it is not some sort of violent communities, again, I want to stress, but enhancing communal relations. So kind of we have this idea of belonging to work versus belonging to community. Well, maybe some of those jobs actually merge both. So I think I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and the next one is a question that I'm curious about. And you mentioned that money in your presentation, that money restricts or enables resources, and so can be seen as permitting or restricting lives to some extent. As you know, I think Marxists would be quite aligned to that view, and maybe, you know, part of the reason why they aspire to a world without money in the first place. What is your view on this? Is this a practical aspiration, and if so, how could we get there?
Did I understand you correctly? Did you say Marx has made similar? Did you say Marx or market?
No, Marxists.
Yes. So once again, Veblen's work is a direct continuation of political economy, and Marx is a creation and challenging also of political economy before him. And when I say direct continuation, well, the frameworks are somewhat different, but the concerns with capitalism are a continuation of political economy. So that's how I see Veblen, a continuation of Marx, with different frameworks. So I make between terms, first of all, words, terms, concepts, theories, frameworks, paradigms. Marx and Veblen are more or less, I would say, in one paradigm. They have different frameworks, but they're in the same, they have somewhat different theories that kind of overlap. They have different terminologies. This is the basic difference. But and some of the concepts overlap. It's very interesting in economics how you can have those. But I don't see them, even though methodologically there are differences. What I said is not inconsistent with Marx's argument, how we get. But again, I want to emphasize that I do appreciate plurality in theories and frameworks. I think within heterodox economics, we're in one paradigm, we have different frameworks, and we can talk about similar things, but sometimes one framework will bring more richness, or just people think in different, there is place for all sorts of frameworks and concepts within that. How we get to there, I think, I'm not the only one to say this, but I think that whatever action we take today is what brings us. It's an evolutionary pathway. When you say evolutionary, we don't exactly have a end that we know, but we are trying to solve problems. And one problem that we have today to solve is the continuous persistent unemployment and the disenfranchisement of people and the locking of people into oppressive situations. And I think that's for that reason I would say job guarantee is first. It's a step towards solving some problems. I do not want to claim a specific path for everybody, but when you have policies, when you have particular policies that threaten livelihood, that threaten people, when those are addressed, these are first steps. This is what I can say. And people work from different avenues. I would say education and opening people's minds is absolutely important. For this reason, I'm in academia. We teach and we try to make people think. And I think this is what you can teach in different levels, not only in academia, obviously. By the way, your podcast does a very good job reaching beyond academia. And I think this is what I can say.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really good answer. Thanks. And we have time for one last question. And there's one from Stuart Medina. And he says, we have experienced recently price tensions in the electricity market in Europe. The price of the megawatt per hour has skyrocketed. Could this be seen as an example of institutional arrangement in favor of capital accumulation? And he also added a comment later about, how he always he thinks that politicians often present institutional effects as being completely natural, and he gives this as an example of that.
Well, I use Judge Veblen'S answer. He wrote. Of course, he wrote basically on disputing these natural market outcomes, right? The whole thing about his writings is going beyond the natural, which is not natural, which supports vested interest. And you can read one book, a short one, 1921, written, The Engineers and the Price System, which is a kind of summative of book of his development of the vested interest and the theory of the business enterprise. So I'm not familiar with your electricity markets that much, but I'm aware of the similar issues. And working in institutional economics actually is very useful to look into. And that work is usually based on Veblen's understanding and discussion of the theory of the business enterprise, as well as absentee ownership, which I think you can read absentee ownership. All of Veblen's writings are kind of quite involved and not quite easy reading in terms of language. That is why people just go grab one word and use it any way they want. And that could work sometime, but in other words, they don't engage too much with books. But you can read, if you want, Absentee Ownership, 1923, Theory of the Business Enterprise, 1904, and the Engineers in the Price System, 1921. And there are some essays also on price and the role of credit. I think I will leave it at that.
Okay. We have run out of time anyway. Thank you very much for the questions to the audience. And thank you again, Professor Todorova. It's been fantastic having you with us.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for the questions and for your attention.
Okay, we'll be back in 15 minutes for the next session with Randall Wray on the Green New Deal. So I'll see you in 15 minutes.
Patricia, those questions that we have, I haven't looked at all of them. Can I save them?